Welcome to part 2 of The World of the Thompsons of Sonnenberg. When last we left off, Mr. Thompson, Fred's father, had just passed away and had left his entire estate to his daughter, Eudora Adams. Later that year, the Thompsons and Williams attended Clark's graduation from Williams College. He planned to move to New York City. Before he left Canandaigua, he visited his uncle at Sonnenberg. Fred wanted to give him $850 for expenses. However, Clark had written George Baker and had procured a temporary job at First National. He surprised his Uncle Fred with the news. Fred told Clark that he could live with his aunt and uncle in New York City, but Clark wanted to make his own way. Down in New York City, Fred and Mary were also involved with Teachers College, now part of Columbia University. Fred was on the Board of Trustees along with Mrs. Choate, George Vanderbilt of the Biltmore Estate, William Rockefeller, and others. In 1894, the new state-of-the-art Teachers College building opened in Morningside Heights on land given by Mr. Vanderbilt. It had boilers for heat, electric lights, and elevators. Mary was a yearly sponsor of the graduates' reception and dance at Teachers College. Fred was the president and stockholder of the Maritime Canal Company, incorporated in 1888 with the mission to construct, operate, and manage a canal across the Republic of Nicaragua or nearby. It was estimated that the project would cost $66 million, which was 1/7 of the cost of the Panama Canal, which had run out of money at the time. 39 men were hired to take the route that the canal would follow and make suggestions. The group had to walk through jungles with the Nicaraguans using machetes and encountering poisonous insects and snakes along the way. The company had to pay Nicaragua $9.6 million for the land and rights of way. Unfortunately, the working conditions and lack of funding slowed construction, and ultimately the company went out of business. Mr. Baker, Stanford White, Augustus St. Gaudens, F.F. Thompson, and Andrew Carnegie were among the Metropolitan Museum of Art trustees who visited the Slater Museum in Connecticut to investigate a collection of plaster reproductions of ancient sculpture. The Met was considering starting a similar collection, and already $200,000 of the $3.3 million needed had been raised to create the country's largest collection, with input given from experts on ancient cultures from around the world. The Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad mentioned earlier went through the town of Kaukauna, Wisconsin, and became a changeover point for the workers. In 1891, Mr. Thompson donated a building and its furnishings for the railroad workers to be used as a clubhouse and reading room, paying and furnishing it for about $250,000. Hundreds attended the 1892 dedication. The facility was busy, especially between midnight and 4 a.m. It became known as the Thompson Memorial YMCA. It was raised in 1967. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company, another company Fred was involved in, ultimately took over the smaller Milwaukee line. Eventually, they were all absorbed by the Union Pacific. In 1890, the new New York Central Railroad depot in Canandaigua was completed. It was touted as one of the most beautiful on the line. The Thompsons had wanted a train station befitting their guests and got the Vanderbilts, owners of the rail and acquaintances, to make it happen. And here's a photo of the depot with the Canandaigua Hotel in the background. As you've heard, Fred was on a number of boards. Here are a few others. "86-year-old Myron Holly Clark, pictured here, died on August 23rd, 1892. One newspaper called him the venerable gentleman in their article. Myron was remembered for his anti-slavery stance as governor. After his death, Charlotte now lived alone. Here's a photo of Fred and Mary, and I believe that is Charlotte in the middle. During that same year, Mary was the project chair for the New York State's entry for the Columbian Exposition's World Fair in Chicago. Books by female authors of New York were collected and displayed at the fair, then donated to the New York State Library. In 1892, the Women's Hospital of New York, which both Mary and Fred were involved with, managed to secure property for a new hospital. Mrs. F.F. Thompson was the assistant treasurer for many years. The Thompsons were among those invited to hear Dr. Dvorak, the director of the National Conservatory, do a rehearsal of the debut of the New World. Fred was also part of these organizations. The Thompsons were members of the Oak Ridge Club in Harlem during the 1890s. There were 30 stockholders and 60 members of the club, including the Goulds, the Fahrenstocks, the Juilliards, and the Bakers. This club allowed women and families to be treated as equal members. Members would drive carriages 12 miles from Manhattan to the 7-acre estate with a house and stables in the Kingsbridge area of the Bronx. It was always stocked with food, and members could stay overnight. It offered comfort and seclusion near the city. The club held sleigh rides and dances, but there was no bar and there was no billiards. The area was ultimately filled in with the city's Jerome Reservoir. Mrs. Russell Sage, Mary's friend, was a suffragist who lent her name and financial support to the cause. She asked how women could be taxed but had no representation without a vote, and they were not allowed to be jurors. She sent around a petition to get the word male removed from the Constitution, and her friend, Mrs. F.F. Thompson, had already signed it. Fred would attend many Williams alumni events. The Williams College class of 1894 held a supper in honor of F.F. Thompson at the Kenmore House in Albany, which was about 40 miles from the college. The following month, Mary and Mrs. Russell Sage were among those attending the anniversary festivities for the Women's Hospital. Plans were underway for the new hospital. Land had been bought between 92nd and 93rd Streets. Fundraising for the hospital had begun. They needed to raise $35.4 million. Later that year, the Memorial Hospital for Women and Children in Brooklyn opened. Back in 1889, Alanson Trask and Frederick Ferris Thompson gave the land on Classon Street at St. Mark's Avenue to the hospital. The trustees and staff were all female, and only women and children were treated there. The modern facilities even included apartments for the staff. As the bank was doing well, as seen here by the bank statement in 1895, so was Fred, and he continued to donate to various causes. Back in Canandaigua, the Union School students were invited to a kite flying contest at F.F. Thompson's farm. The winners were selected for best flying kite and best looking one, and they were given books as prizes. The Thompsons' property was once also the site of intrigue. In June of 1896, some boys walking through the woods on the Sonnenberg property found silverware that had been stolen from Mary's sister's house the previous year. 2 months after that was found, a man walking through the property also found burglary tools, a lantern, money, and more silverware. Fred and Mary attended Clark's wedding in 1897 in Nashville. After he was married, Abby Clark Williams wrote a letter to her son and told him he should give his wife an allowance, but not ask her for an accounting of it. Mr. Thompson was part of a group formed to get rid of corruption in local Republican politics of Murray Hill and get better people involved in voting and running for office. By now, the years had begun to take their toll. Fred had suffered with palsy for years, and it affected his handwriting, as seen in this letter of 1898. By the eve of the new century, Fred had been in failing health for a while. Bedridden only a few weeks, he died at 2:20 p.m. on April 10th, 1899, at his home in New York City. According to George Fisher Baker's biography, upon his deathbed, Fred told George Fisher Baker to take care of the old lady. Fred's doctor wrote on his death certificate that he had been treating him since January of 1898. He attributed his death to a stomach hemorrhage, and he had suffered from a stomach ulcer and atrophic cirrhosis hepatitis, which is damage to the liver due to either acute hepatitis or toxic hepatitis, which occurs when a body is exposed to certain chemicals or heavy metals. Some have theorized that the chemicals used by him in the early years of photography could have led to this. His funeral was held at 283 Madison Avenue at 4 p.m. on April 12th. His body traveled to Canandaigua on April 14th. The service in Canandaigua was held at the Clark House on Gibson Street. Fred, who died 15 years to the day after his brother, was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in Canandaigua. Coincidentally, his parents and his brother were also buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, but the one in the Bronx. At Williams College, classes were canceled and a memorial service was held on campus. The students sent flowers and a condolence letter to Mary. A professor was selected by the staff to attend the funeral. It was estimated by the school that Fred had donated $11 million during his lifetime. The board of directors of First National Bank paid tribute to F.F. Thompson at their next board meeting. Meeting notes said, Mr. Thompson's genial and generous temperament made him always the most agreeable associate, and his absence will be felt and regretted by those who survive him. While he was continuously a director of the bank and one of its largest shareholders, he had spent most of his time on philanthropic ventures. Williams and Vassar both received portraits of Fred by the artist John H. Littlefield. Fred's estate was valued at around $178 million. Vassar thought that they'd be getting some of his fortune. Alas, it was left all to Mary in the 1897 will. However, it is interesting to note that 3 days before he died, Fred made a codicil to his will, which read, I, Frederick Ferris Thompson, of the city of New York, do make, publish, and declare this as for a codicil to my last will and testament, the provisions of which codicil I direct shall take effect only in the event that my wife shall die before I do. In that case, I give, devise, and bequeath all of my property, both real and personal, of every name, kind, and description, share and share alike, to the following persons and corporations, or to so many of them shall be capable of taking the same, to wit. My sister, Eudora Adams, my niece, Eleanor Adams Grosbeak, my wife's sister, Zilpha Clark Backus, my wife's sister, Charlotte Clark, my wife's sister, Abigail Williams, my wife's niece, Mary Clark Williams, Williams College in Massachusetts, Vassar College in New York, Teachers College in New York City, and Women's Hospital in New York City. As it was clear that Fred was in poor health, and we've never heard that Mary was sick at the time, it was very unlikely that Mary was going to die before Fred. Did he want the codicil as some sort of memo to Mary, knowing that she would end up following his wishes? Or did he mean it as some sort of support or validations of women's rights that no man in the family would get an inheritance? 3 weeks after Fred died, his sister Eudora followed. She was buried in Coxsackie, New York. She left all of her personal effects to her daughter. John Thompson's house at 295 Madison Avenue was passed down to Frederick, her son. He donated $186,209 to the Graham Home for Old Ladies in New York City and had a room named in her honor. In May 1899, a memorial was held in Kaukauna, Wisconsin for Fred. It was attended by many railroad workers who heard letters of former railroad managers and the president of the railroad. Songs of remembrance were sung. The ink and paper portrait of Fred hanging in the Y was covered in black crepe. 2 months after Fred died, Mary wrote to her nephew Clark, "Dear Clark, I am sending you the check that you may get it on your Uncle Fred's birthday, the 14th of June. It is a present from him as well as from me, a token of our love and confidence. I am sure you will use it wisely, but you must use it exactly as you please." In July, Mary decided to use the old Rankin property to the north of Sonnenberg for a home for the aged, to combat poverty and sadness of older residents, including some of her childhood friends. She promised to maintain it for 3 years, and then she would create an endowment. Abby's husband and daughter, and Zilpha and Charlotte Clark, were among the members of the board. The establishment was called Clark Manor House in honor of their parents. Soon after, Mary, her brother, and Canandaigua's Dr. Jewett went on an extended trip to Europe. Mary made a number of direct gifts to family once Fred's estate went through probate, most likely fulfilling the codicil of April 7th. And here are the other Clark siblings in later age. Not long after Fred died, it was discovered that a First National Bank employee had embezzled $25.4 million, which was more than the bank had in cash reserves. To raise more money, the bank's stock was split and bought up by J.P. Morgan, Mr. Twombly, J.D. Rockefeller, Henry Frick, and Marshall Field. After Fred died, Mary traveled a lot. It was said that she had gone around the world 7 times. She went to the Orient, Europe, Egypt, and around the United States and Mexico. She apparently had a great metabolism, touring all day and still going out in the evenings. During the months of November to April, Mary was usually away from Sonnenberg. In December of 1899, Mary Williams, daughter of Abigail, joined her aunts Mary and Zilpha for a trip to Egypt. Young Mary was born in 1868 and attended the Upham School of her aunt. She was her parents' caretaker. Mary Clark Thompson succeeded Fred on the Board of Trustees at Vassar and Teachers College. At the Women's Hospital in New York, Mary had been one of their managers since 1872. She gave them money and land for a nurse's home. In June 1901, Mary rented an estate in Reigate, Surrey, England, and invited her entire family to visit. They returned in November for a short stay, with Mary and Zilpha and the Bakers staying at Sonnenberg. During Mary's absence, workers had made $7.2 million in improvements to the buildings and grounds of Sunny Hill. Reconstruction of the Sonnenberg's gardens had begun after Fred's death. It's said that the pipework alone under the estate cost over $3.5 million. Sonnenberg was supported by a butler, an assistant butler, and a third butler if needed. There was a cook, an assistant cook, kitchen maid, personal maid, housemaids, a coachman, and later a chauffeur. Of course, there was a head gardener and the rest of the gardening staff and the farm staff. On average, there were usually 50 to 60 people on staff. Whenever George Fisher Baker visited, Mary gave strict instructions for everything to be perfect in the house. When Mary had finished remodeling and expanding the mansion, she asked Addison Wilbur, Sonnenberg's superintendent, to create a large aviary for songbirds. A few months later, in January 1902, Abby Clark Williams died unexpectedly before a trip with Mary to Southern California. She had caught a cold at a community function at the Union School, which turned into pneumonia. She died surrounded by her husband, children, and 3 sisters. Her brother, Lorenzo, arrived shortly after she died. Mary told the Ontario County Times that she wanted to create a hospital as a memorial to her husband, with both men and women on the board of directors. She bought the former property of the Ontario Female Seminary, now the site of the McKechnie House. Francis Allen designed the hospital, originally incorporating the front of the McKechnie House with an addition built onto the back. The hospital would have 45 beds and would cost $90,000. Unfortunately, by the fall of 1902, it was evident that the house foundation would not support the hospital, so the entire house was demolished. During construction, the builders went on strike. They wanted a 5-cent an hour raise to 45 cents. Mary intervened and raised the wages. This would be equivalent of going from $14.22 to $16 today. The building of the hospital continued for 20 more months. On July 28, 1902, Mary opened a recreation park and playground on Howell Street, adjacent to Sonnenberg. Tennis courts, toboggans, 2 indoor baseball diamonds, 1 outdoor diamond, concrete grandstands with locker and shower facilities, sand piles, swings, a track, trapeze equipment, and a golf course were all furnished by Mrs. Thompson. The Buffalo Inquirer wrote that L. Langer and Barry of Rochester were installing shrubs so that the little ones will be free of the gaze of passerby, and at one portion of the grounds will be a nice, big, clean, healthy sand pits in which babies can disport, meaning frolic, while servants or little mothers rest nearby in the shade. In 1905, a fountain was added to the park in memory of her sister. It had a basin at the bottom for dogs to get water. In September of 1902, Electa Ferris, Fred's mother, died at age 95, having outlived all of her children. Mary was especially generous with local religious institutions, such as these. Downstate, in accordance with Fred's wishes, Mary dedicated a new library at Vassar to take the place of Uncle Fred's nose, as his library had been called. Foundations for the new building began in 1903. Mary also paid for a new librarian's house. She gave money to Vassar students who were working through college and would occasionally send anonymous gifts like expensive paintings to the school. She is credited with getting Mrs. Russell Sage to donate to Vassar. According to the codicil of Fred's will, he wanted to have a church built at Williams. Mary's chapel donation, estimated at over $17 million, ended up being the most expensive college church. To make room for the church, Griffin Hall had to be relocated a few hundred feet. The chapel was another design by Mr. Allen, styled after an English Gothic church, and it held between 650 and 1,000 people. In the 159-foot bell tower, 10 bell chimes had the ability to play 190 songs. There were 26 carved stone Bible texts placed within the nave and stained glass windows by John Hardman of England. And this is the interior of the chapel. The dedication on Commencement Day, 1905, was attended by President Teddy Roosevelt. As a stipulation to the gift, Mary required that no fees be charged for events in the chapel. Both the chapel at Williams and the Woodlawn Chapel in Canandaigua contain the same verse on the memorials. Verily, I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And here is the memorial to Fred. On July 14th, 1903, tragedy struck the Sonnenberg farm. English farmhand Richard Paul was bringing in hay from the field, and while loading it into the barn, he accidentally stepped into the hay-covered chute, hitting his head as he fell 24 feet. His co-workers discovered his lifeless body on the floor of the barn. He left behind a wife and 5 children. Later, Mary would buy the property his family rented so that his wife could live there. Mary's generosity around town did not go unnoticed. A book with hand-illuminated lettering by the Tiffany Company, valued at over $4,000, was signed by nearly 8,000 Canandaigua residents in 1903. Mary was one of the largest donors to Columbia University in 1903, giving $12,065,000. The gift had originally been anonymous and smaller, but once she increased the total, her identity was revealed. The money was used for the F.F. Thompson Memorial Building, which was the largest building for women on the campus, the gymnasium. Mary tried to ensure that women's interests were addressed. It was 4 stories high, contained locker rooms, dressing rooms, a pool, a bowling alley, hair drying room, and the physical education department. Not only did it serve the women of Teachers College, female students from Barnard, Columbia graduate students, and Horace Mann were also able to use the facilities. And here we see the gymnastics room, the pool, the hair dryers. The pool is actually still in use today and is used by local community members. Noted sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, who knew F.F. Thompson, was commissioned to create a bust for the Williams Chapel and bronze and marble portrait plaques of Fred. And as you can see, these were valued at about $347,000. Mary would also give a large donation to the Teachers College Library Fund. The dean of the school would say at one point that Mary had an intuitive knowledge of human nature, a keen intellect, abounding common sense, and a forceful personality. The following year, another tragedy struck the workforce of Sonnenberg. A mason from Sonnenberg was attacked by jealous co-workers while walking down Pleasant Street. Guns were drawn and 10 shots were fired. The instigator was shot through the leg, another was shot in the back and lungs, and another was believed to have received fatal wounds to the stomach. The Masons were all Italian, and the police and crowd insinuated at the time that it was mafia related. On June 15, 1904, a day after what would have been Fred's 68th birthday, the Frederick Ferris Thompson Memorial Hospital was dedicated. Its mission was to provide the necessary and proper facilities for the medical and surgical treatment for the residents of Ontario County. The board of directors included Clark and Mary Williams. 500 guests were invited to the ribbon cutting, with 150 attending the ceremony. They included the leading doctors from Albany, Rochester, and Buffalo, Mr. and Mrs. George Fisher Baker, and the Sewards from Auburn. After 2 years of construction and $6.9 million spent, there was a state-of-the-art, well-equipped hospital in Canandaigua. Mary required that the patients be treated regardless of creed or financial situation. She also donated a quarantine building and eventually a training school for nurses and the county's bacteriological lab. The dedication was led by Myron Clark Williams for his aunt, and there was a benediction. After the ceremony, attendees could tour the hospital with its elegant decor. On August 19th, the facility was open to the public for tours that nearly 3,000 attended. A subsequent 1904 trip to Europe yielded a 4 by 6 foot painting of Myron Holly Clark for Albany. Painted by a famed French portrait artist and reportedly costing over $300,000. While in London, Mary received word that there was a push to have trolley cars running up and down Canandaigua's Main Street and pledged $342,000 to fight it. Mrs. Thompson had purchased Milford Plantation in South Carolina in 1903 as a winter retreat for her family and friends. A year later, a notice appeared in the Sumter, South Carolina newspaper that said, "Don't trespass on Mary Clark Thompson's land at Milford and Bloom Hill or face the law." The property also came with a resident, a former slave who locals called Daddy Ben Pleasance, who died on the estate in 1910. And there's a photograph of him on the screen. The estate has since been restored, and this is what it looks like today. In 1905, Mary gave Clark and his wife property called Hawthorne Beach in Connecticut at Byron Point. Clark noted that his uncle Sam Backus, a civil engineer, had made marks on the rocks there in 1856 when he delineated the New York and Connecticut state borders. A Democrat and Chronicle article from 1905 was titled "The Millionaire, the Wild Animal's Hope." It detailed how the wealthy helped the Bronx Zoo populate its exhibits. While it kept referring to all of the donors as the men, it mentioned Mary Clark Thompson as one of them. She had given a Baker's roan antelope, an Attucks antelope, a water buck, and an Altai wapiti, which is a type of elk. Another article was titled "Prominent Men Contribute to Unique Fund of National Association of Audubon Societies," and listed all of the men, including Rockefeller, George Baker, George Eastman, and Mary Clark Thompson, who gave money to attract and study native birds on large estates. The Biloxi, Mississippi Daily Herald wrote, "Mrs. Frederick Ferris Thompson of New York is an unknown woman, in a public sense, that is to say, who is doing handsome things with her money without the embarrassment of conditions." Mary and George Fisher Baker remained very good friends. When she was in New York, there was a regular Sunday afternoon visit between the two of them to discuss problems and policies. Mary often gave a Sunday night dinner for friends. When George Fisher Baker's daughter, Mrs. St. George, was pregnant with her third son, Mary asked if she would name him Fred, since the Thompsons had no children. He was named Frederick Ferris Bly St. George. As an interesting aside, Mr. St. George's cousin was Sir William Orpen, the artist who created the portrait that now hangs in Sonnenberg. It's believed that he had an affair with Mrs. St. George, Baker's daughter, and that her daughter Vivian was his child. On June 14, 1906, a devastating storm hit Ontario County that may have been a tornado. Trees were toppled, chimneys fell off houses, and outbuildings blew over. Crops were ruined by hailstones the size of eggs. Some animals were injured or killed by the hail. The Geneva newspaper reported that Canandaigua was basically shut down due to windows being shattered in buildings and people being injured. It was estimated in the business district alone, damage was more than $5 million. At Sonnenberg, the greenhouses needed $1.6 million of glass replaced. In the aviaries, all of the glass houses were damaged and birds were killed because the netting inside prevented them from flying out of the way of danger. Later in the summer, the swim school on Canandaigua Lake was opened by Mrs. Thompson so that all children in the town could learn to swim. It remained open until 1969. Mary was involved in a number of organizations through the years, and they included There was a new building dedicated at Williams Women's Hospital of New York in 1906. 200 female donors gave money, including $5 million from Mary, for the 7-story white limestone and marble building. Hundreds of Friends of the Colored Orphan Asylum and Association for the Benefit of Colored Children attended an open house at the new cottage-style campus at Riverdale on Hudson. One of the cottages was funded by Mary and called Clark Cottage in tribute to her father. At a Department of Agriculture chrysanthemum show in Washington, D.C., the reputed stars of the show were the Mrs. Roosevelt and the Mrs. F.F. Thompson specimens, which were developed by former Sonnenberg garden Charles Toddy. In 1907, when Clark was up for the New York Superintendence of Banks, Mary advised him to do his best and to be honest. She also offered to help him with his finances. During March of 1907, Mary went to a resort in Mexico. A headline of the Mexican Herald out of Mexico City wrote, "Taken away by doctor, Mrs. F.F. Thompson ill, leaves for the United States." Mary was known to be intolerant of illness when she was sick. She was stoic, not a worrier, and seemed unflappable during emergencies. According to the article, Mary's party were on a 3-week tour of Mexico. Early in the week, the group had traveled south from Mexico City's Iturbide Hotel. By Tuesday, Mary had fallen sick. She was gravely ill by the time the doctor and nurse arrived on Wednesday night. She was diagnosed with an acute heart issue and nervous shock. She improved some after receiving medical attention, but the doctor felt that she should be moved to a lower altitude. A doctor and nurse accompanied her to San Antonio. She was told to remain there until she felt better. The plan was to leave San Antonio and then continue on a trip to New Orleans and then on to Hot Springs, Virginia. In April, it was reported that Mary had been at her winter resort in Mexico and was now at home in New York City. Per the Newark Courier, in June of 1908, Mary arrived home from Europe. She had to declare a $198,000 dress and had to pay a fortune in taxes on it. Mary Williams, daughter of Abby, had married a Kirkham, and she gave birth to Mary Clark Kirkham in 1908. 4 years later, the little girl's mother died at Milford following a long illness. Mary Clark Kirkham's great aunts, Zilpha, Charlotte, and Mary, all doted on her. Later that year, Mary offered to open the grounds of Sonnenberg to the public a few Friday afternoons during the summer. John Handerhan had planned a new pheasant house that year as well, considered the largest in the U.S. with every known type of pheasant. The glass house measured 100 feet and contained 10 rooms and an outdoor run. The Democrat and Chronicle wrote, "The aviaries are some of the best in the state, with over 800 birds. Ornithologist Ernest Watts and 2 assistants take care of the birds. Watts also serves as a vet for the birds, giving medication and performing surgeries. Seed for the birds is bought half a ton at a time. Birds are from all over, including Mexico and Australia. Included in the bird collection are local birds as well as rare ones." Mary wanted everyone to be able to see the birds, so she opened the aviaries each Saturday from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. throughout the year to many visitors. At the Williams graduation ceremony, Mary's contributions for the year were announced. $32,000 for the entertainment lectures, $16,000 for the President's Fund, $2,400 for prizes. She also donated books about folklore and Napoleon to their library. $503,000, as well as relics for the Myron H. Clark collection, were donated by Mary in 1909 to establish a New York State Historical Museum. Another approximately $500,000 was pledged by Mary that year to build the chapel at Canandaigua's Woodlawn Cemetery. Francis Allen was again enlisted to design the structure. Later that year, Fred's nephew, Frederick Thompson Adams, died in New York City. He left an additional $161,000 to the Graham Home for Old Ladies in Brooklyn for the maintenance and support of the Eudora Adams Memorial Room. His grandparents' home, the Anchorage, was left to his wife, as was 295 Madison Avenue. Around this time, Mary funded a public fountain in front of the Canandaigua Hotel in the town square. In 1910, Superintendent Wilbur announced that Sonnenberg's Gardens would be open twice a month that summer. Camera and vehicles were not allowed on the property. The Rose Garden that year sported 8,000 rose bushes. Sometimes people would come from other states. One day, some of the visitors also went to tour the courthouse to see 2 portraits that Mary had donated that cost more than $500,000. That season, more than 20,000 people came during the 9 open days. Businesses all over Canandaigua saw profits from all of the people surging into town. The Democrat and Chronicle reported that Main Street looked as if a circus crowd had taken possession of the town. Wagon operators made money taking people from the steamships on the lake as well as the train station to Howell Street. There are numerous mentions in local towns' newspapers about residents going to Sonnenberg or having been. Church, grange, and club outings frequently included a visit to Sonnenberg. Train companies in Geneva or Penn Yan would advertise special fares if groups were headed to Sonnenberg's open days. The Northern Central Station in Penn Yan said that in July 1910, 1,000 more people took the train when compared to a year earlier, with Sonnenberg visits being the reason. The estate grounds would be open from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., with 50 attendants on hand to help guide the visitors. Zilpha sold her home at 28 East Gibson Street to Addison Wilbur's sister in 1911. Eventually, the Wilburs sold it to St. Mary's Church, who tore it down to make room for their parking lot. Around this time, the New York Zoological Society worked to create a zoo. $8 million was raised, with $150,000 coming from Mrs. F.F. Thompson. You may have heard of Mary's narrow escape from the fateful trip of the Titanic in April 1912. She and her friends bypassed the scheduled voyage as she had heard about a tulip display in Holland that she wanted to see. They heard of the disaster over breakfast the morning of April 15th. Many people wanted to walk the grounds that summer to see the new additions. One Friday recorded nearly 10,000 visitors coming through the gates. Train companies reported that evening trains to Geneva were packed until 9:30 p.m. The following week, another 9,000 came to see the gardens. At least 275 people came from Penn Yan, so 6 cars were needed on the train just to accommodate the Sonnenberg visitors. Another 3,000 people came by car. During the days following, a rumor circulated that Sonnenberg would be closed to the public for the remainder of the year due to the damage caused by the crowds. This was dispelled by the estate manager. By the end of the season, 50,000 people had visited during the 7 public days. 1912 was more memorable due to the introduction of the automobile lawnmower, which replaced 6 hand mowers. For the 1913 commencement at Vassar, Mary committed $2.3 million to establish a chair of political science. Fred's nephew, Ferris S. Thompson, died in 1913. In his will, most of his bequests were memorials in the name of his beloved mother, Abby Sherman Thompson. His wife sold her father-in-law's house, Samuel Thompson's, at 297 Madison Avenue. It was valued at $5.4 million. It was leased to the Aero Club. Plans were in the works for a new historical society and library for Canandaigua in 1913. 300,000 had been donated by Mary and another 80,000 by her sister. Mary also bought new collections for the Historical Society. Additional recipients of Mary's giving were Mary acquired the Atwater block, where the old YMCA is, and donated the land worth over $1 million to the federal government for a new post office. The federal government had only budgeted $7,500 for a new post office. Mary had had plans drawn up for an elegant federal style building and paid the difference to have it constructed. This is why Canandaigua had such a grand post office for a town of its size. And in this picture, you see the post office, and then just to the side of it, the taller building, that was the Union School. In June 1913, 300 children gathered at Sonnenberg for a folk dance recital. Early in that year, Mary donated a 5-story brownstone property at 291 Madison Avenue for the creation of the Williams Alumni Club. Fred had bought it for $1.3 million. Clark organized the club, which ended up having over 700 members. Fred's portrait hung on the wall in the lounge. The Yates County Chronicle reported that Mary was upset that Canandaigua might become a city, thus permitting alcohol. So she decided not to open her property to the public in 1914 or pay for a director for the playground. Thomas Edison, his wife, and son were once guests of Mary's at Sonnenberg. Mrs. Thompson had an old-fashioned car with a step on the side in New York City. She also had a Pierce Arrow and a Packard. She was listed as one of the first women to own an electric car. And here are some photographs from inside Sonnenberg with Mrs. Thompson seated in the Great Hall. Clark visited his aunt each morning in New York City and took over her accounts. During World War I, his secretary took over the duty. Mary would discuss with them her financial matters and give her directives. George Baker gave to numerous causes and founded the Harvard Business School, who thanked him by naming the school's library after him. And this is a recent picture of it. Former Sonnenberg gardener Charles Toddy went on to develop new plant species. In 1915, a catalog from Lidl and Springfield Roses featured the Mrs. F.F. Thompson rose, which was shell pink with a deep glowing heart of bright pink. Back in Canandaigua, Mary's sister Zilpha was active on the boards of Clark Manor House, Thompson Hospital, and the Historical Society. She lived at Sonnenberg, where she died in 1915. During that year, during Williams College Founders Day celebration, a portrait of Fred was presented. Dr. Taylor had the following to say: Frederick Ferris Thompson, he was more than an enlightened and devoted college trustee, though he was that. He was a friend of the students, virile, alert, humane, sympathetic, and generous, of wide business knowledge and experience, a strong believer in the worth of the college to the individual and the state, his enthusiasm quickened by his sense of humor, which helped over many a serious situation with which he was related, and lives in their grateful affections, and his own good works, as well as in the magnificent memorials which have been erected in his name. How deep his interest was in education was abundantly proved by libraries, laboratories, academic buildings erected by him here and elsewhere, and by his constant contributions to the equipment and running expenses. But less visible tokens, there are long lists of students, both men and women reaching through the years who owed their college opportunities to Mr. Thompson's unproclaimed generosity. For a long period in one college, there were 4 students in each college class whose bill were wholly met by him, and I venture to assert that no worthy student who wished to come to Williams and who needed help ever failed to win his interest. There are 3 portraits of Mr. Thompson owned by the Williams College Art Museum. Mary bought 75 acres east of Syracuse for an outdoor geological exhibit and gave it to the state. It was dedicated to her father. Today, it is known as Green Lakes State Park. Mary was an early supporter of the Metropolitan Opera and had a box there on odd Fridays. The following year, Mary gave $4 million to the Women's Hospital of New York to build an addition. In 1917, Mary's brother Lorenzo died in Michigan. In the time since his father had helped to create the State Bank of Michigan, of which he was the president, that bank had merged with the First National Bank of Detroit, of which he became vice president. Around 1918, after years of pressure in the financial sector, Clark Williams suffered what was called in his obituary a breakdown. After spending time recuperating, he began to work in Europe on the war front. Mary would write Clark, who was with the Red Cross, and tell him to let her know what he needed. In May 1918, she detailed the Red Cross fundraising efforts. She said that Canandaigua's goal was $443,000, but she didn't think it would get that far. But she pledged to make sure it happened. She also gave $1.2 million to the YMCA's efforts. She gave Clark encouragement and said that she missed seeing him and having his assistance. Updating him about his little niece, Mary Kirkham, Mary said that she believed little Mary would do good in the world. She signed the letter, "I send my love, full measure, pressed down and running over." Letters were signed lovingly or affectionately. Mrs. Thompson's love of plants extended beyond Sonnenberg. The annual report of the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx detailed how Mary gave $2,000 to the plant fund, as well as $95,000 for the construction of a school garden shelter. In Canandaigua, Mrs. Thompson gave $88,000 in bonds to each of the following nonprofits: the Ontario Orphan Asylum, the Congregational Church, the Ontario County Historical Society, and the Clark Manor House to start endowment funds. In 1919, the nurses at F.F. Thompson Hospital were given use of Pine Bank for the summer by Mary, her cottage down in Naples. School students were given permission to tour the dairy and stables at Sonnenberg. Williams College was considering a war memorial in the Thompson Chapel. The trustees were nervous that Mary wouldn't want to share Fred's memorial. Mrs. Thompson said it was fine and that she would have the memorial constructed near the altar with the names inscribed. She had twice tried unsuccessfully to have elaborate war memorials erected in Canandaigua. The annual report for the Women's Hospital in 1919 contained the following: "So quickly does Mrs. Thompson bestow her kindnesses that few besides the Board of Governors realize how much the hospital owes to her generosity. The board is sincere in its gratitude." Mary had paid for repairs and updates for the entire building. She also donated 12,000 relics, including tools, some more than 10,000 years old, from indigenous tribes that had lived in New York to the State Museum. During that period, Mary was trying to acquire all of the land properties between 40th and 41st Street on Madison Avenue. It was believed that she was trying to start a commercial project. She took out a $450,000 mortgage in 1920 to buy number 295 from her nephew's widow. Mrs. Thompson funded the Williams Maternity Pavilion at Thompson Hospital, as well as the nurses' home and the supervisor's dormitory. The goal was to have a modern maternity ward in Canandaigua. Clark and Addison Wilbur acted as Mary's representatives at the unveiling of the facility. Charlotte Clark gave money to furnish a large private room in memory of her sister Zilpha. Lorenzo Clark's widow donated furniture in his honor. Mary was also paying off the hospital's debts. And this is a picture of Women's Hospital in New York City. Less than a mile down the street from Thompson Hospital, Mary paid $5.4 million to buy and renovate the Canandaigua Hotel at the site of the current city police headquarters. No expense was spared in the remodeling. By purchasing the hotel, Mary had ensured that a corset factory would not take the place of one of the city's landmarks. The hotel burned down in the 1970s. And this is what it looked like on the inside after the updates. The city of Canandaigua gave Mary a hand-engraved parchment of appreciation by artist Fred Crandall in 1921. It was signed by City Council and the mayor to express appreciation for her generosity and citizenship. The National Academy of Science Award in the Evolution of Earth and Life, the Mary Clark Thompson Medal, has been presented every 3 years since 1921 to recognize important services to geology and paleontology. Charlotte Clark was still good friends with George F. Baker. They would exchange birthday cards and he would visit her. Her nephew Clark said that as she aged, Lottie was extremely concerned with who would get her possessions after she died. She served on the board of Clark Manor House. As her health declined, meetings would be conducted at her house. On her father's birthday each year, she would throw a party for the home's residents. The Merrill Hose Company set about raising money for an ambulance for Thompson Hospital in 1922. They received a telegram from New York City saying that Mrs. Thompson's friends, otherwise known as George Baker, would buy it. Mary had been in relatively good health in the beginning of 1923. On the evening of July 27th, she suddenly got chilled, and by Saturday morning, her doctor from New York City arrived. She died at Sonnenberg at 2:10 p.m. on Saturday, July 28, 1923. She was 87 years old. Her memorial service occurred on Tuesday, July 31st at 3 p.m. at Sonnenberg. Most local businesses closed at 2:30 p.m. to honor her. The Reverend Livingston Taylor of the Congregational Church and former Canandaigua Reverend Lewis Reed conducted the funeral. Her employees were all pallbearers. This included Ernest Watts, who was the avian curator, Weldon Kershaw, the head gardener, James McCare, the head farmer, Michael Farrell, her coachman, Arthur Tuppen, one of her butlers, William Parnell, a houseman, Thomas Chappell, the mechanic and chauffeur. Her funeral was attended by many of her friends. George Fisher Baker, the Allens of Boston, President Garfield's son, now president of Williams College, and the Sewards from Auburn all attended. Mary's will, per the biography of George Fisher Baker, left an estate of over $248,300,000. Fred's estate had come from investments in Western Railroad bonds and securities, as well as ownership of First National. Mary's investments had been curated with George Baker's assistance and doubled her fortune. The 80 acres of Sonnenberg and its contents were given to her nephew, Emery Clark. Pine Bank was given to Clark Williams, as was 283 Madison Avenue. The books in that house not taken by Clark went to Williams and Vassar, with Williams having first rights of refusal. The cottage in Elohoe went to Mary's great-nephew, William Reeve Clark. Great-niece, Mary Kirkham, got 60 acres and Cedarhurst in South Carolina. Milford and 700 acres went to Emory. Hawthorne Hills and 700 acres went to Clark. Both Emory and Myron split another 5,000 acres and received $5.3 million in cash, and the Canandaigua Hotel was in trust to continue operations. The bulk of her estate was all of the property between 40 and 41st Streets on Madison Avenue that Mary had been buying up. She also had 7,000 shares of Bank of New York stock and 5 million in Liberty bonds. The New York Public Library got all of Mary's Bibles, Korans, missals, parchment books. Woodlawn Cemetery received $266,000 for the chapel and grave maintenance. The New York Zoological Society and the Met Museum both got $887,000. The Met also got all of Mary's collections of Chinese enamels, ivories, jades, fans, crystals, miniatures, and any paintings not expressly given to others. Charlotte Clark received all personal and family mementos, all jewelry, laces, clothes, china, and linens. George Baker and his daughter, as well as her nephews, were each left specific paintings. Endowments were set up for Thompson Hospital and Clark Manor House in the amount of $3.5 million. Vassar and Williams College were each left $5.3 million. The Women's Hospital was left money for the care and maintenance of the pathology building Mrs. Thompson had donated. Executives were also responsible for making sure that the tuition and bills of any student already being supported for their education at Williams or Vassar or Teachers College was paid. The city of Canandaigua was left $440,000 to pay for the upkeep of Sonnenberg Park and the swim school. A 1919 codicil stated that her employees at the time of her death, who worked at least 5 years for her, would get an inheritance. And here are some of her employees. Sonnenberg's fire station. Employees Prentice Wilder and John Handerhand each got $266,000, as did her personal maid, Lena Anderson, and head gardener, Weldon Kershaw. Other employees working for Mary at the time of her death would receive $170,000 if they had worked there 10 years or more. If they had worked between 5 and 10 years, they would get at least $88,000. A legal fight brought on by employees questioned what in her employment. Addison Wilbur said that meant 63 people, including the playground and the swim school. The surrogate court ended up ruling in favor of 23 employees, and the estate paid over $3.8 million to settle. Mary's will gave employee Michael Farrell, her coachman, $178,000. Remember at the beginning I said that this had all begun as a census record. I had come across a 1920 census from Canandaigua that said that Michael Farrell was a coachman at a private estate and knew that it was most likely Sonnenberg. He and his family lived on the second floor of the carriage house. The reason I was looking for Michael Farrell, he was my great-grandfather's cousin. Charlotte Clark, the last remaining Clark sibling, died at age 92 in 1929. And here are all the different bequests that she left. As a gesture acknowledging how much the Clarks had meant to him, George Fisher Baker donated a new $109,000 ambulance to the hospital to replace the one he had given 7 years before in memory of all the Clark sisters. In 1930, Emory sold Sonnenberg for just over $1.8 million. It was worth $36.4 million to help Canandaigua get the new Veterans Hospital. In a letter, he said, "Any contribution that I have made was with the thought that I was carrying out my aunt, Mrs. Frederick Thompson's desire to give all aid possible to her native town and its people." I do have to wonder, though, if the Great Depression might have influenced his decision to part with the expensive property. When Clark Williams died, he left Pine Bank to his niece, Mary McKechnie. The Congregational Church was given over $150,000 for an Abigail Clark Williams fund. Nephew Emery died in 1958. Today, Sonnenberg and Green Lakes are New York State parks. Milford has been restored and is a house museum in South Carolina. The First National Bank of New York is now Citibank. Clark Williams, in his autobiography, quoted Einstein to describe Frederick Ferris and Mary Clark Thompson. Only a life lived for others is a life worthwhile. The Kaukauna, Wisconsin newspaper wrote of Mr. Thompson's life and echoed Clark's sentiment when it concluded that the distinction of Mr. Thompson was not his wealth, but the use he made of it in doing good to his fellow man. And while continuing the work that she and Fred had started, giving so much of herself and her fortune to the community, the description could be applied to Mary as well. At one time, a resident of Canandaigua could be born in Thompson Memorial Hospital, play at the Sonnenberg playground, learn to swim at the swimming school, read books from the library, attend a school Mary helped to fund, go to or get married in a church she subsidized, have a baby in the hospital, work in one of the businesses she supported, retire and live at Clark Manor House, and then have a funeral at Woodlawn Chapel and be buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. Through all of the Thompsons' generosities and effort, they all ended up touching Canandaiguans in nearly every aspect of their lives, and in many ways, especially in Canandaigua, still do. Thank you for listening to the Thompsons of Sonnenberg. Here's some suggested reading if you want to read up any more about their lifetime. There's a book called Adventures with Old Houses by Richard Hampton Jenrette. He was a businessman who used his extra money to restore old houses, and he was the one who restored both Milford and George F. Baker's house. And you can get that through the library system. As alluded to earlier, Village Life in America by Carolyn Cowles Richards. She grew up on Main Street and talks about all of the places in Canandaigua that you may be familiar with. The Gilded Year by Karen Tanabe is a fictional story, and Mr. Thompson makes his appearance in it as it takes place at Vassar. Clark Williams' autobiography, where some of the material in this talk came from, and also George F. Baker's biography.